Hello everyone, today we are going to talk about Fnatic. They are in a huge slump, everyone can see that. Ever since those two Graves Soraka games, it seems like they just can't get back on their feet. They seem uncoordinated, uninspired, and even their wins look rough. Many analysts have been talking about Nemesis' poor play, Bwipo's and Illy's ints, their terrible neutral setup, and even their tendencies to overfight. Remember that you've heard the term Fnatic's fight syndrome on this channel 6 months ago. When I'm watching Fnatic, I see one major difference from last split that actually was barely talked about. Their early game. Last split, and even in 2019 summer, Fnatic was by far the absolute best early game team in LEC and probably one of the best in the world. Their ability to create gold leads was undeniable. When they wanted to win an early game and get their leads, they did. Their later stages were a bit shakier, but the stats don't lie. At the spring split, Fnatic had an average gold lead of 647 at 15 and CS lead of 6.8. From those leads, Reckless held an impressive 502 average gold lead over his opponent in lane at 15, Bwipo 120 and Nemesis 240. Selfmade was actually down in gold, holding a minus 78 gold difference from his opponent, but that was because he was sacrificing himself a lot to help his laners. He was still either the second or the best jungler in the league that split, going toe to toe with Jankos. On the other hand, this split looks entirely different. In their 13 games, Fnatic has an average gold deficit of minus 277 at 15 and are even in CS. And now it gets really bizarre. While Reckless, Bwipo and Nemesis all have gold deficits at 15 of 45, 401 and 340, Selfmade has a gold lead at 15 of 422 gold. This is absurd, and in this video we're going to try and understand why is this happening. Let's start with the simplest reason, the meta. With the jungle XP changes from 10.4, the jungler that gets to level 9 first gets to keep up with the laners in EXP and create a massive lead over his opponent because of the XP scale on camps and the removal of catch-up EXP. Since then, we are seeing a lot more carry junglers and teams that play for their junglers instead of junglers that play for their laners. The game became very jungler-centric and not lane-centric, and the champions changed accordingly. The slow farmers and heavy gankers like Gragas have completely fallen out of favor, while champions like Graves, Kha'Zix and Olaf are rising up in priority, and of course Lee Sin can do it all. We also see a lot of Trundle, Volibear and Sett, but that's mainly because they are decent into the meta champions, can clear effectively and have their spikes in time for the early Drake fights. In short, putting the enemy jungler behind or getting your jungler ahead is super effective because of the XP changes, and the natural objective focused game only enhances that. Selfmade wasn't blind to these meta shifts of course. While last split Selfmade was playing mostly Gragas and Lee Sin, with both present in 16 out of his 28 games, this split his most played champions so far are Graves, Kha'Zix and Lee Sin, which are all junglers that can or should be played around to get the leads that they need to carry a game. Fnatic have changed their playstyle with the meta. Instead of the jungler playing around the laners, Selfmade, with his picks and pathing, is taking way more selfish decisions, and it's very easy to see. It's especially easy to read around top, as Bwipo's wave management skills are lacking, while Reckless and Illy are far better at that. Bwipo needs a lot of coverage from his jungler early on, and we could also see it in the Broxa days. Last split, Selfmade knew how to juggle between keeping Bwipo from inting or hard losing a lane and being bot when he needs to. Now, when he is playing for himself, Bwipo is putting himself in bad situations all of the time and no one is covering for him. Even the bot lane was left alone at times. Let's watch two examples of what we've just talked about. In Fnatic's game vs Vitality, at around the 4th minute, Fnatic's bot lane were pushing in a wave. Instead of coming bot to cover for them, Selfmade went to farm his jungle. Skin snuck into the lane, but Reckless sensed something was wrong and was able to put a good ward to avoid the gank. Instead of coming bot now and making sure that Skins is not coming for round 2, Selfmade went on to farm while Fnatic had to push another wave. Skins came back from the river and Vitality got the first blood onto Haley. Last year Selfmade would have been bot lane at this timing. The carry-oriented Selfmade with the Kha'Zix prioritized his farm over his bot lane safetiness. At around the 5th minute in their game vs Misfits, Selfmade was around bot making sure that Reckless and Healy can safely push, planning to go to his Krugs after and continue his clear. Meanwhile, Bwipo was also pushing into Den, but Den managed to freeze the wave near his tower. Bwipo couldn't decide if he's giving up the minions or committing to the push into the tower, and he stood in a really weird position that doesn't grant him anything. Razor came in and Misfits got a kill, while Bwipo lost his flash. In this example, Selfmade couldn't really cover for him as he was covering bot, but it's another example for bad wave states that aren't fixed that were barely present when Selfmade was playing for those waves. Secondly, the fight syndrome. Even in the laning phase, Fnatic can't back away from a fight. In those 8 post-Grave Soraka weak games, Fnatic took 8 pre-15 bad fights that they could have just easily disengaged from and either earn an advantage elsewhere or keep on scaling to a stronger point. I don't have the comms for those games, of course, so I can't know for sure who calls for those fights, but it is possible to assume from champion behavior. Also, it sometimes seems like more than one player is calling for the fight. When it happened, I give the credit to all of the players involved. And now for the stats. Out of those 8 pre-15 fights, Bwipo called for 4, Healy for 2, Nemesis and Selfmade for 1, and the entire team committed for 1 more. Bwipo's early game fights and his callings for fights seem really off. But what if this is his style? What if for these 4 bad calls we have 15 good ones? Well, it's not the case. The good skirmish calls are hard to count since every successful dive bot have inflated Selfmade's Reckless and Healy's stats, but I'll show them anyway. And the Bwipo point still stands. Pre-15, Healy had 7 successful fight calls or engages, Selfmade had 5, Reckless had 3, Nemesis had 2, and Bwipo had only 1. From these stats, we can take 2 things in my opinion. While Healy is inting a lot of kills, most of them are late game. The plays Fnatic are initiating around him in the early game usually work very well. Secondly, Bwipo's fight calls are very badly split. From the Fnatic voice comms videos, we know that he is one of the 2 voices that are calling for the fights. It seems like this year he had lost his touch around those calls, and that he is making the team lose a lot of early games with his bad fight calls. In my opinion though, it's not entirely his fault. Although he does need to take responsibility and probably call less in the early game, we have to remember that the majority of the fights are happening around bot. In Bwipo's case, 3 out of the 5 calls were bot lane, and 3 unsuccessful ones at that. The team should not let him call fights around bot lane, as he probably doesn't know the early game matchup of those champions nearly as well as the other players, especially in the early game when he has no experience playing versus them. How can he know if a Doran plus Pickaxe Senna is stronger than a Doran plus Pickaxe Aphelios? The bot lane should know that, and they should know to call him off when he overreaches. Now, let's look at the 2 examples for Fnatic's overforces in the early game. In their game versus G2, at around the 6th minute, Jankos moved bot for a gank. Caps ulted in and Nemesis ulted in to stop the play. Now if we stop the game and look at the draft, we can clearly see that Fnatic outscale. G2 have relatively short range champions that were picked into Graves, Aphelios and Galio. When Fnatic's carries get their items, the game is over. G2's only hope is to snowball through bot lane and get so far ahead that they can either win a 5v5 through their lead, force an early Elder, or win through split pushing with Caps and Wonder. Instead of waiting, the fight syndrome kicked in, and Fnatic with low HP numbers decided to go in. While they did manage to get perks in the end, they lost 3 members and gave G2 the first lead that they desperately needed to start snowballing the game through their win conditions. In Fnatic's game versus Misfits, they again had the scaling comp that should be able to kite Misfits' comp back to oblivion in the later stages of the game. At around the 14th minute, Misfits already had a pretty big gold lead and they had set their eyes on the bot lane tower. Fnatic decided to try and outplay the dive, knowing that they have the TP advantage and moving everyone into the bot side. Misfits have managed to get the tower and the kill onto Reckless before the rest of Fnatic had arrived. Now, in a 4v4 situation, Fnatic had the option to back away and keep on scaling, hoping to get to stronger breaking points by the time they have to fight for objectives. Instead, the fight syndrome kicked in again, and they tried to get the 4v4 while they are completely split up. They lost 2 more kills, putting Misfits even further ahead, and remember, this was a 4v5. Meanwhile, Dandan was having a field day in the top lane, farming around 3 waves and almost getting a full tower. Lastly, let's talk about Nemesis. He has been struggling this split, that's for sure, and everyone can see that. But what about his early games? We can divide those early games into 2. The Control Mages early games. While playing Control Mages, Nemesis' early game is decent, except for that horrible Syndra game. He is only 1 minion behind on average at 15, and he is only behind 27 gold, though he had 2 very inty early games versus Misfits and Excel. When he is playing a Control Mage, he can shove the lane from afar and help Fnatic set up objectives and dives around their bot lane more easily. Fnatic's win rate when he is on those Control Mages is 5 out of 7, and when not counting the Syndra, which is a bit different than the other mages, 5 out of 6. On the other hand, when he is playing the other stuff, Fnatic's win rate is 2 to 6. Personally, he is on average at 15, 13.5 CS behind, and has a goal deficit of 653 on average. It's clear that he is not good at those champions, and that Fnatic as a team are struggling to utilize them to their potential. When Nemesis is playing those, he is far worse, and the team is doing worse. So what did we learn? What does Fnatic need to do to have good early games again? How can they get better knowing that the meta can be jungler centric and that the early neutrals are super important? For starters, they should stop playing around Selfmade. Even though Selfmade is getting his leads in the early game, it comes with a price and it's his laner's leads. Fnatic simply can't play early games well when the bot lane is behind. Enough with the Sennas, enough with the Sorakas. I want to see Reckless on a real damage carry, Healy on an engaged support and Selfmade on Lee Sin, Volibear and Trundle. Reckless is a super reliable carry and Healy is a super reliable engage tool when the bot lane is ahead. Just get them ahead. Kalista, Aphelios, Ezreal, Syndra and even things like Twitch can be utilized so well by Reckless. He just needs his team to set him up. Secondly, Bwipo needs to get a bit better in the early game wave management department. This is not a top lane centric meta, quite the opposite. The jungler has to farm in this meta, so Selfmade can't really be anywhere anytime without getting too far behind. Bwipo has to learn to lane by himself so that Selfmade could farm and invest all of the time he is not farming to mid and bot lane. Furthermore, the Fnatic members that know their early matchups should not be afraid to call off an engage led by Bwipo around the bot side, as he doesn't know and shouldn't know the matchups around there in the early game. Lastly, Nemesis should be put solely on control mages for now. He is not having the greatest split of his life, that's for sure. When he plays the Oriannas, Azirs and Corkis, Fnatic have a 5 to 6 win record, which is great. Those champions let him get away with his poor laning phases this split and are very easy to get priority with when he needs to. They are the best champions in the meta and they are his best champions historically. Just let him play those and stop it with the Echo TF and Galio. To finish on a high note, I was extremely pleased watching Fnatic's game yesterday versus Origin. Reckless on a carry, Healy on an engage tool, Nemesis on a control mage and Selfmade on a champion that can help his laners early. Xerxes' early gank stop even covered the Bwipo angle. This is the Fnatic I want to see coming into playoffs. Thank you everyone so much for watching. Check out my channel for more videos that I have done. As always, I will see you for another one of these in 2 weeks. Be sure to subscribe to check it out.